The document arrived at Clarence House on a cold Tuesday morning, sealed in the deep oxblood leather folder reserved only for instruments of the sovereign's personal will. It was carried by a single private secretary, not the usual two, and it was placed on the desk of the king without a word. Charles removed his glasses. He looked at the folder for a long moment before he touched it. Inside was a decree he himself had commissioned in silence over the preceding 11 weeks, drafted in the strictest confidence, seen by only 3 living people, and concerning the single most sacred object in the British constitutional order, the crown that would one day rest upon the head of his eldest son. He read the first page once, then he read it again. Then he asked for the doors to be closed. When the private secretary hesitated, Charles repeated the instruction in a voice that had dropped almost to a whisper. Close them, and lock them. The forbidden boundary had already been crossed the moment the decree left his pen, the boundary that said no reigning monarch shall alter the terms of his heir's inheritance without the knowledge of the heir himself. Charles placed one hand flat over the paper, as though to keep it from lifting into the air. I have done what I swore in private I would never do, he said, to no one but the empty room, and it will be understood only after I am gone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The decree was not a will, it was not a codicil. It was something older, quieter, and far more binding. A sovereign instrument, meaning a document signed by the reigning monarch in his personal capacity as head of the royal house, carrying the weight of family law rather than public statute. Within the walls of the palace, such an instrument was known simply as a house order, and house orders had shaped the private architecture of the monarchy for over 3 centuries. They could alter the sequence in which titles descended. They could reserve certain patronages for certain heirs. They could, in the rarest of circumstances, place conditions upon the manner in which a future king assumed the visible symbols of his office. Charles had signed exactly one such instrument in the entirety of his reign, and it concerned William. The private secretary who had carried the folder that morning was a man named Sir Malcolm Avery, a retired communications consultant recalled to service for this single task, because he had known the late Queen personally and could be trusted to speak of nothing. He had left the room after the doors were locked, but not before placing a second, thinner folder on the corner of the desk. That second folder contained the only 3 witnessed copies of the decree, and a short handwritten note in Charles's own script naming the 2 individuals besides himself who had seen it. One name was expected, the other was not. Charles opened the note, read it, and pressed his fingers briefly to his forehead. Then he lifted the telephone and asked for the Prince of Wales to be summoned to Clarence House at the earliest possible hour. William arrived that evening in a plain dark suit, having driven himself from Windsor. He was shown directly into his father's study, and the doors were closed behind him for the second time that day. Charles did not rise. He gestured to the chair opposite the desk, and between them lay the oxblood folder still closed. I have signed something, Charles said, and you must hear it from me before it is discovered by anyone else. William sat down slowly. He did not speak. He had learned, over the years, that when his father began a conversation with restraint of that particular kind, the words that followed would rearrange the shape of his life. Then Charles saw it in William's face, the flicker of recognition, the smallest tightening around the eyes, and understood that his son had already heard something. Someone inside the palace had helped shape the claim before it ever reached the person it concerned. The wound of the moment did not belong to Charles alone, nor to William alone, and this was the difficulty of it. 3 lives inside the family were now bound to the folder on the desk, and each of them would interpret its existence differently. For Charles, the decree was an act of protection, a father shielding a son from a burden he himself had carried too long and understood too well. For William, when he came to read it in full, it would feel like something else entirely. A private negotiation conducted about him without him, a rearrangement of his future performed by hands that had not asked his consent. And for Catherine, the Princess of Wales, the woman who had spent 2 decades preparing in silence for a role she had never sought but had never once refused, the decree would carry a third meaning again, one that touched the quiet architecture of her own place inside the family. Catherine was told of the document's existence the following morning in a small sitting room at Kensington Palace by William himself. He did not show her the pages. He described them. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, and when he had finished she remained still for a long moment before she spoke. She used only one word: considered. It was the word she used when she meant that a thing had been thought about for longer than anyone realized, and that its consequences had not yet finished unfolding. William understood her at once. He rose, kissed the top of her head, and returned to his study to read the decree for a second time. To understand what Charles had signed, one must first understand what the crown itself actually is inside the private grammar of the royal house. The crown, in its public sense, is the physical object of gold and jewels that rests upon a monarch's head on the day of coronation. but in its private sense, the sense in which the family speaks of it among themselves. The crown is a bundle of rights, duties, patronages, household appointments, ceremonial precedences, and personal properties that pass from sovereign to heir in a sequence, largely governed not by law but by the reigning monarch's own written instructions. A patronage, meaning a charitable or institutional responsibility assigned personally by the sovereign, is one such right. A household appointment, meaning the selection of the private staff who will serve the next reign, is another. And the manner and moment of coronation itself, the timing, the form of the oath, the composition of the procession, the objects carried before the new king, these too fall within the sovereign's personal instruction. Charles's decree touched several of these at once. The story of how the decree came to be written began not in the 11 weeks of its drafting but nearly 2 years earlier, in a small closed-door meeting at Windsor that almost no one now remembered. It had been a rehearsal, of sorts, not for any ceremony but for a contingency, meaning a plan prepared against a possibility that no one wished to name aloud. Charles had gathered 4 people in a room lined with maps of the home counties. William had been one of them. Anne, the Princess Royal, had been another. Sir Malcolm Avery, then still in his semi-retirement, had been the third. And the fourth had been a woman who had since left royal service under quiet circumstances, a former private secretary named Miss Eleanor Frayne, whose careful handwriting still appeared on certain briefing papers in the Cabinet Office archives. At that meeting, 2 years before the folder ever arrived at Clarence House, a single question had been raised by Anne in her characteristically direct manner. She had asked what protections existed for William in the event that Charles's reign proved either much longer or much shorter than the average of his predecessors. She had asked what would happen if the heir came to the throne exhausted rather than prepared, or came to it too quickly to have chosen his own household. She had asked, most quietly of all, what would happen if the pressures upon the heir's family in the years before accession became so severe that the coronation itself arrived at a moment of private crisis rather than public triumph. No one had answered her at the time. But Charles had written down the questions in his own hand, on a small card that he had kept in the top drawer of his desk ever since. Miss Frayne had left the room that afternoon, carrying a folder of notes that should never have left the building. It had been an oversight, corrected within hours, and the folder had been recovered intact by the following morning. But somewhere in the interval between her departure and its recovery, a photograph had been taken of 2 of its pages. The photograph did not surface for nearly 18 months. When it did, it appeared not in the press but in a private communication sent to a member of the extended family, accompanied by a short message suggesting that the pages be examined with care. Charles had learned of the photograph 6 weeks before he began drafting the decree. It was the moment, he would later tell William, when he understood that the contingency Anne had named at Windsor was no longer theoretical. The breach had been deliberate. Someone had wanted the family to know that the questions had been asked, and that the answers, whenever they came, would not remain private. Miss Frayne was 71 years old now and lived in a small house near Winchester. She had been visited once, quietly, by a member of the royal household in the weeks before the decree was signed. She had received her visitor courteously, had answered every question put to her, and had left the room only once, to fetch, from a shelf in her hallway, a slim leather diary of the year in question. She had turned to a particular page, had pointed to a single line written in her own hand, and had said only, "I told them at the time that this would come back." Then she had closed the diary and placed it on the table between them. The visitor had left within the hour. The diary remained on Miss Frayne's table for several days afterwards, and what became of it after that, no one in the household knew. Charles had begun drafting the decree the following week. He had written it himself in longhand on the small desk in his private study at Highgrove, working in the evenings after his official day had ended. He had shown the first draft to no one. The second draft he had shown to Anne, who had read it in his presence, had said nothing for several minutes, and had then asked only one question: "Does William know?" Charles had answered that William would know when the time was right and not before. Anne had nodded once and had handed the pages back. She had not raised the matter again until the day the decree was signed. The confrontation between father and son took place that same evening at Clarence House, in the study with the doors locked and no advisor present. Charles opened the folder himself. He turned the pages one by one so that William could read them at his own pace, and he did not speak while his son read. When William reached the final page, the page that bore Charles's signature and the countersignatures of the 2 witnesses, he sat back in his chair and looked at his father for a long moment before he spoke. "You have decided the shape of my coronation," William said. It was not a question. "I have decided the protections around it," Charles answered. "The shape remains yours, and the household. The household appointments are reserved to you. I have written that in explicit terms. No serving member of my own household may transfer to yours without your personal invitation. That is the first protection. And the patronages? Charles paused. This was the harder answer, and he had known it would be. Certain patronages, he said, are placed under a temporary reservation. They will not descend automatically. They will wait for your instruction. This is the second protection. William absorbed this in silence. Then he asked the question that Charles had been waiting for since the folder had first been placed on his desk that morning. And the timing? Charles removed his glasses. He placed them carefully on the desk beside the folder. The timing of your coronation, he said, is reserved to you, not to the government, not to the household, not to any advisor, to you. You will choose the month. You will choose the form of the procession. You will choose whether Catherine walks beside you, or precedes you, or follows you, and no protocol officer will overrule you. This is the third protection, and this is the one I have most wanted to give you. William did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was very quiet. Why did you not ask me first? Because if I had asked you, Charles said, you would have refused. You would have told me that you did not require protections. You would have told me that you were prepared for whatever came. And I would have believed you, because you would have meant it. But I have watched you carry things you should never have had to carry. And I have watched Catherine carry things beside you. And I have decided that the crown you inherit will not be the crown I inherited. It will be something you have room to shape. That is my gift, and it is also my apology. William closed the folder slowly. He did not open it again. There is something else, he said. You have not told me who countersigned it. Charles reached for the smaller folder at the corner of the desk and withdrew the handwritten note. He passed it across without speaking. William read the two names. He read them a second time. Then he looked up. And I understand, he said, but the second name, he stopped. He set the note down. The second name changes everything. The second name was Camilla's. And William had not known, until that moment, that his stepmother had been party to the drafting of an instrument that would shape the reign after her own. He had assumed, as most of the family had assumed, that Camilla's role would end with Charles's own, that she would step back into the private life that had always suited her better than the public one, and that the transition to the next reign would proceed without her involvement. But her signature on the decree meant something else. It meant that she had been consulted. It meant that she had approved. And it meant, most importantly, that she had agreed to a set of provisions concerning her own future position that had not yet been made public. Then William saw it. On the final page of the decree, beneath the signatures, there was a short paragraph he had not read carefully the first time. He read it now. It stated that upon the accession of the new king, the queen consort, meaning Camilla in her present title, would relinquish certain honorary appointments in favor of the incoming Princess of Wales. It was not a demotion, it was a transfer, and it had been agreed in writing by Camilla herself in advance and without condition. William read the paragraph a second time. Then he closed the folder for the final time that evening and placed both hands flat upon it. She agreed to this, he said. She proposed it, Charles answered. The paragraph is hers.
Not mine.
The door closed behind William at just past 10 o'clock that evening. He did not return to Windsor immediately. He drove instead to Kensington Palace, where Catherine was waiting for him in the small sitting room where she had received his news that morning. He did not describe the decree to her a second time. He simply took her hand and told her what the final paragraph contained. She listened. She did not speak for a long time. And then she said quietly, that was not asked of her. She offered it. Yes. Catherine looked away toward the window, where the lights of the city were faint against the dark. Then I owe her a conversation, she said. Not tomorrow, but soon. The family council convened 4 days later at Windsor in the Oak Room with only 5 people present. Charles sat at the head of the table. William sat to his right, Catherine beside him. Anne sat opposite them, and Camilla sat at the foot of the table in the seat she had occupied at every private family gathering for more than 15 years. There were no advisors. There were no secretaries. There was no folder on the table between them, because the folder was no longer necessary. The decree had been signed, witnessed, and lodged in the archive of the royal house, and its terms would take effect on the day of Charles's death and not one moment before. The purpose of the council was not to alter the decree. It was to acknowledge it. Charles spoke first briefly, describing what he had done and why. Anne spoke second, confirming her witness and her agreement. Camilla spoke third. She said only that she had proposed the final paragraph, because she had understood, from the beginning of her marriage to Charles, that certain honors had always been intended for a Princess of Wales rather than a queen consort, and that she had held them in trust rather than in ownership. She said this without emotion, as a statement of fact. She said it looking directly at Catherine, and Catherine returned her gaze without flinching. Then Camilla added a single sentence that no one at the table had expected. I would rather give them to you now in writing than have them taken from me later. Silence. Catherine did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. "I will not accept them as a transfer," she said. "I will accept them as an inheritance from you. That distinction matters to me, and I hope it matters to you." Camilla inclined her head. "It does," William spoke last. He said that he accepted the decree in its entirety, that he would honor its provisions when the time came, and that he would ask only one addition to be lodged alongside it in the archive. A written acknowledgement from himself that he had read the document, understood its terms, and consented to them in the presence of his family. Charles agreed at once. The acknowledgement was drafted that same afternoon, signed before the council dispersed, and placed in the same oxblood folder that had traveled from Clarence House 4 days earlier. The folder was then closed for the last time and carried away by Sir Malcolm Avery, who bowed to the king, bowed to the future king, and left the room without speaking. The leak escaped, as leaks always do, within a fortnight. It appeared first as a single paragraph in a national newspaper, describing only that a private instrument of the sovereign's will has been signed in recent weeks concerning the arrangements of the next reign. The paragraph named no one. It quoted no one, but it was enough. Within 48 hours, an evening broadcaster had confirmed the existence of the document and had described, in general terms, the 3 protections it contained. Within a week, a veteran royal commentator had written a long analysis suggesting that the decree represented the most significant private act of the reign, and possibly the most generous. The word generous was picked up by other outlets. It became the frame through which the story was understood, and it was accurate. The public reaction crystallized around a single image. A woman in her 60s, wearing a plain coat, had walked to the gates of Kensington Palace on the Sunday following the first newspaper report and had left a small bunch of white roses tied with a handwritten card. The card said only, "For the father who thought of his son first." A photographer had captured the image before the flowers were taken inside by a member of the household staff, and the photograph had appeared on the front page of a Monday morning newspaper beneath a headline set in stark black type. The headline read, "A crown prepared with care," 5 words. It was the headline that defined the story. Inside the palace, Catherine kept the handwritten card. She placed it in the small drawer of her writing desk at Kensington Palace, alongside a photograph of her 3 children and a letter her mother had written to her on the morning of her wedding. She did not speak of it publicly. She did not speak of it to William. But when Camilla telephoned her the following week to arrange the private conversation Catherine had promised, Catherine mentioned the card in passing, and Camilla was silent for a long moment before she said, "That is the review you should keep. Not mine." The 2 women met at Clarence House on a gray afternoon in the second week after the leak. They spoke for nearly 3 hours. No advisor was present, no note was taken. What passed between them has never been reported, and it is likely that it never will be. But when Catherine left the building that evening, she walked out through the front entrance rather than the private one, and she paused on the step to speak briefly to the small group of well-wishers who had gathered at the gate. She thanked them for coming. She did not mention the decree. She did not mention Camilla. She said only that she had spent the afternoon with a woman she admired, and that she had learned something from her that she would carry for the rest of her life. Then she walked to her car and was driven home. Could compassion without limits become permission? This was the question the family had asked itself, in one form or another, for many years. The decree Charles had signed offered one answer. It said that compassion could be structural rather than sentimental. It said that a father could protect a son not by shielding him from his inheritance, but by shaping the inheritance so that it could be carried. It said that a queen consort could relinquish honors not because she had been diminished, but because she had understood, from the beginning, that some things are held in trust rather than in possession. And it said, most quietly of all, that a princess could accept an inheritance not as a transfer but as a gift from another woman, and that the distinction between those 2 things was the difference between resentment and respect. There remained, in the weeks that followed, one figure whose reaction to the decree had not been reported and could not easily be predicted. Harry, the king's younger son, had not been named in the document. He had not been consulted in its drafting. He had not been present at the family council at Windsor. Whether he had been informed of its existence at all, and if so by whom, remained a matter of speculation both inside and outside the palace. What was known was that a letter had been sent from Clarence House to Montecito in the week following the family council, that it had been carried by hand rather than transmitted electronically, and that it had been signed by Charles himself. What the letter contained, no one outside the 2 men who wrote and received it could say. But it was noted, by those who watched such things carefully, that Harry made no public statement in the weeks that followed the leak. He did not comment on the decree. He did not comment on his brother. He did not comment on his stepmother. He remained for once entirely silent, and in that silence some read acceptance. Others read grief. Others read nothing at all. because Harry's silences had long since become the most difficult of the royal texts to interpret. Miss Eleanor Frayne died quietly at her home near Winchester in the 3rd month after the decree was signed. Her death was recorded in the local register and reported briefly in one national newspaper. The slim leather diary that had once sat on her hallway table was not among the effects listed in her will. What became of it, and whether it had ever left her possession at all, remained unknown. Sir Malcolm Avery attended her funeral. He was seen to place a single white rose on her coffin. He did not speak to any of the other mourners. He returned to London the same evening, and he retired from royal service for the second and final time the following week, leaving behind on his desk at St. James's Palace only a single unmarked folder, empty, and a passcard that had already been deactivated. Catherine had refused from the beginning to treat the decree as a victory. She had refused to allow the household to brief the press in her favor. She had refused to permit any interpretation of the document that cast Camilla in a diminished light. When a member of her own staff had suggested, in the days after the leak, that a background briefing might be offered to clarify the personal generosity of the Princess of Wales in accepting the transferred honors, Catherine had turned to the young woman who made the suggestion and had said, very quietly, "There is no personal generosity to brief. I received a gift, I did not earn it, and I will not be praised for accepting what another woman chose to give." The suggestion was not raised again. And in the months that followed, as the story receded from the front pages and settled into the longer memory of the family, it was Catherine's refusal, more even than Charles's decree or Camilla's paragraph, that came to define the meaning of the whole affair for those inside the palace who understood such things. Charles returned the oxblood folder to the cabinet in his study at Clarence House on the evening after the family council. He placed it on the second shelf from the top, behind the glass, in the same position where his mother had kept her own most private papers during the final years of her reign. He locked the cabinet. He placed the key in the top drawer of his desk, and then he took from that same drawer the small card on which he had written, 2 years earlier, the 3 questions Anne had asked at Windsor. He read the questions once, then he read them a second time, then he placed the card face down on the desk and left the room. Titles could pass, loyalties could shift, but the shape of a crown, once prepared with care, could not be unprepared by any hand that came after. The decree belonged to William, the paragraph within it belonged to Camilla. The refusal of revenge belonged to Catherine, the questions that began it all belonged to Anne, and the signature at the bottom of the final page belonged, and would always belong, to a father who had decided, in the quiet of an evening at Highgrove, that the greatest gift he could give his son was the room to become the king only his son could be. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.